Okay, hello everyone. This is Anthony Guido in the central office at the Cohen Veterans Network. Thank you all for joining today. Before we get into our presentation, just a reminder that we are providing these network-wide webinars on the second Thursday of every month, and we're really excited about the summer schedule we put together. We also want to hear from you out there, so if there are topics you want to hear discussed network-wide for the fall and winter and in the future, just let us know. We're happy to put together a nice varied program for everyone. To let you know, just the upcoming schedule, Thursday, July 11th, we are doing mental health care for LGBT veterans and family members. That will be done by a pair of clinicians from the El Paso VA. And Thursday, August 8th, we are doing a webinar with our new partners, Rally Point. Elise Hart from the External Affairs team will be joined by Carlos Madden of Rally Point to talk about some exciting things that we have coming down the pipeline with their vast online platform. And those are both at 1 p.m. Eastern time. But for today, this is PTSD Awareness Month, so we're very happy to be presenting with you, or to you, Connecting the Dots, PTSD Education, Treatment Options, and Resources, given by Dr. Elissa McCarthy, who is a clinical psychologist who specializes in the assessment and treatment of PTSD and insomnia. Her primary role is serving as a consultant for the National Center for PTSD Consultation Program. So Elissa, thank you very much for joining us. I'll turn it over to you. Reminder to all of our guests to stay on mute. We will open up things later for questions, or you can use the chat function within the Zoom here to ask questions as well. So thanks again, Elissa.
Yes, thanks, Anthony. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for joining today. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day for this presentation. A couple of things. So I'm unfortunately, since I'm sharing my screen, I'm not able to see the chat, but I really encourage you as questions come up just to type them in, whether it's something that's just crossing your mind in the moment or related to the content. And if for some reason I don't have time, because I'm going to cover a lot of things today, I will get back to you after the presentation. Anthony kindly agreed to capture the chat for me. So know that I will get back to you within the next couple of days related to your questions. So please feel free to use those in an active way. Again, thank you very much for joining me today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I hope to cover. You'll see I have about 74 slides, which is much longer than the hour. But I really just hope to give you a bit of information to kind of get your wheels turning, which they probably are, in ways that you can help the veteran service members and family members that connect with your network. So I'll talk a little bit about PTSD education, as well as help familiarize you with the clinical practice guidelines that were revised in 2017 that the VA and DoD put together in collaboration. Also, just highlight a few of the evidence-based psychotherapies and treatment for PTSD. And what I hope to spend a big chunk of the time for today is really talking about different resources that you may or may not be aware of, in different ways that it may be useful to use in the different roles that you have helping veterans and service members connect with services. To orient you, as Anthony had mentioned, is I work for the PTSD consultation program, which I'll tell you more about later on. But that is part of the VA's National Center for PTSD. And if you aren't familiar with our National Center for PTSD and its mission, I thought it would be good to orient you to the extent to which we really work to further kind of and progress treatment options, education, clinical care, welfare of our veterans and returning soldiers and service members who have experienced trauma and also may have gone on to develop PTSD. And it's done in a variety of ways, which is highlighted in our mission statement through research, education, training, and really is cutting edge in what the field has to offer. And I'll talk to you a little bit about how that may be helpful in the work that you're doing. Within the National Center for PTSD, there's several divisions. Anthony, I'm actually also located in Connecticut, and he happens to be here as well, and gave me a little sense about the network that you all work with within Cohen Veteran Network. but also within the National Center, we're spread throughout the country as well. And I happen to work out of the executive division, which is out of the Vermont VA. And to give you a gauge, depending on where you all are in the country, I'm actually out of the West Haven VA. It does not look this pretty today. It is a cold summer afternoon here, deceivingly so. But it usually does look that nice in the summer. And there I am to give you a little context for who I am and where I work out of. So my primary role is as a PTSD program consultant, but I also continue to see veterans on an outpatient basis through the VA there. As Anthony mentioned, I'm really pleased to be here because June is PTSD Awareness Month, and I'll help orient you to what that means and what that entails. So in 2010, Congress designated June 27th as PTSD Awareness Day, but then in 2014, Congress worked to designate the full month of June as National PTSD Awareness Month. And so when you think about the campaign for this is really an opportunity, more so than what we probably do in our day-to-day lives and work, to bring awareness to everyone who may be impacted by trauma or PTSD about the variety of resources and options for treatment that are out there. I'm really working to decrease stigma and let people know what's out there. I think treatment and resources and other things related to PTSD are only as good as people know about them. And this gives a huge opportunity for us to really designate some information out there. And so the National Center for PTSD has a website that is at the bottom of these slides, and Anthony will post these on a shared drive that you have. And you're welcome to download these to get these hyperlinks. But you'll see different opportunities that you could consider throughout the month from different ways to help increase awareness. And we've laid it out even on a calendar for different ideas through social media, through posting within your offices or clinics, wherever you may be. And we also have opportunities that you can order, and I'll tell you how to do that later on, free printable materials where we will send them, the government publishing office will send them to you free of charge to really spread the word about PTSD. And let me say, this is not just specific to this month. This is anytime you're able to order them, but this is a newer service that we're able to offer because we really found that providers and veterans who are receiving these materials really wanted more. So that gives you a bit of the context for PTSD Awareness Month and what the hope is. Really, it's just to get the word out. And clearly you all are in this meeting because this is important to you. And this is a step in this, bringing this awareness to this meeting. Your organization recognizes the importance of using PTSD Awareness Month as a platform to get the word out. So even if one or two of you are able to do that yourselves and get that going, it makes that much more difference. We make that much more of that web of getting the word out spread beyond just this meeting. So I really encourage you to take that pledge to really work to get this information out. I'd like to start with what is PTSD and get us all on the same kind of page when we're talking about it. So there's daily hassles, right, which may include, let's say, your car breaking down, paying bills. There's major life events. I was thinking about this time in June, it may be exciting things like graduations that are coming up, transitions into different aspects of new jobs. It may be a loss of a job. And then there are serious traumatic events. And this is really what we're talking about when we talk about PTSD. You often hear a lot with the veterans that you may be serving is related to war zone exposure, physical or sexual assault, major accidents, childhood abuse, as well as natural disasters with, depending on where you're located, from tornadoes to hurricanes to flooding, as well as victims of torture. And across the board, when we think about trauma exposure, and this is from 1995, this statistic, which is quite dated, and I'd be interested to hear if we have the updated information, which I'm not aware that we do, if this statistic has changed. But to give you a gauge, about 50% of women at some point in their lifetime have exposure to a traumatic event, and about 60% of men. And so that's, I think, an important aspect to know that trauma exposure, at least half of individuals are exposed to it at some point in their lifetime. But just because someone is exposed to a traumatic event doesn't mean that they go on to develop PTSD. And this statistic is across the board, not just in military populations, but also civilian populations. About 7% go on to develop PTSD. If you look at the top graph up here, it's small, so I'm kind of going to walk you through it to orient you to it. On this side of the graph, you see PTSD symptoms. There's 0 to 100. Higher scores on this graph indicate more severity and intensity of those PTSD symptoms. This part of the graph is representing time in months. So 1 month, 2 month, 3 month, and so on. Right here in this blue line is a typical reaction, an exposure to a traumatic event. It could be a disaster, a major accident, something under that realm that I was talking about. And there's an initial reaction that is typical, right? Some distress related to it, but naturally there's a drop over time, and then over time it really goes down to some kind of memory or experience that happened in the past that's not disrupting one's own functioning. And then there is instances where, and I'm going to look at the dotted line here, PTSD recovered, where someone may have symptoms of PTSD for a longer period of time, but that over time they naturally decrease. But what's probably who you're seeing in your clinics when an individual is presenting with PTSD symptoms are those individuals who have PTSD that has not remitted or kind of gone away naturally on its own and are still really having an impact on the way one is functioning. So when one is diagnosed with PTSD, they meet what we call a criterion A traumatic event. And those were the events that I mentioned earlier around a disaster, combat exposure. But it's not only having that exposure to a trauma, it's the impact and how that trauma is impacting an individual beyond that exposure to the trauma. And so you often may hear about re-experiencing symptoms, often referred to as intrusive symptoms, meaning that they're coming back when you don't want to have them. It can come back in a way of a nightmare or distressing dream, as well as those symptoms related to avoidance, where you're avoiding having to have thoughts of that trauma, avoiding feelings that are associated with it, or memories, or places that remind you of it, or any sort of activities that may bring back that memory. You start to avoid it. There are also shifts in the way one thinks and feels. So not having interest in things that used to enjoy, not feeling as connected. I often have that say, I know that I love my children, but I just don't feel the love. There's that detachment and disconnect in that way. Inability to feel those feelings of joy. I mentioned graduation, and it's a huge accomplishment for a family, but you don't get to experience those at times. And there may be also blame towards oneself and others. And there can be changes in the way that we think about hypervigilance, constantly on guard, irritability, may find that anger comes out a bit more, engaging in behaviors that may not be safe and can at times reckless, difficulties concentrating. A lot of times we hear difficulties related to sleep. And so an individual would have different experiences and symptoms in each of these categories that then result in a diagnosis of PTSD when it's impacting one's functioning as well. And functioning, I mean social relationships, maybe at school, maybe it's at the job, all different aspects of their life are impacted in how PTSD is disrupting it. I thought what would be really useful is to share some of our resources related to the National Center to help you. I just went through what PTSD is, and you may not have that always, based on what Anthony was saying, the different roles that you all have is not having that direct clinical care where you may be explaining a diagnosis of PTSD to a client, but you have a lot of roles in what maybe could really help a client or family members or social support understand what PTSD is when they have questions. And so what I wanted to do was share a video with you that is a brief, what we call a whiteboard video. that is about 3 minutes that goes over the explanation of what PTSD is.
Have you or someone you love ever been in a tornado or car accident, experienced sexual or physical abuse, served in a war zone? Most people have been through some kind of life-threatening or traumatic event, and it's common to have stress-related reactions after a trauma. But when symptoms last more than 3 months and they're not getting better, it's time to get help. Meet Sam. He recently returned from serving in Iraq. For many people, being in a crowded place like a baseball stadium or busy grocery store feels comfortable, but not for Sam. What should be a nice night out, taking his wife Tara to a restaurant, isn't fun for him anymore. He can only handle it if he sits with his back to the wall where he has a good view of the exits, and even then, he's too on edge to really enjoy it. At home, things aren't the way they used to be either. His sleep is restless at best, and some nights Tara isn't sure if Sam comes to bed at all. Sam seems to have a short fuse these days, and sometimes he snaps at Tara over tiny misunderstandings. What he and Tara never talk about is the trauma he experienced when he was deployed. He's never mentioned the guilt, the weight he carries around, wishing he could have done more to prevent what happened. Instead, he's turned inward, pulling away from family and friends. Tara tried to give him some space, but after months passing without change, she really started to worry. She was the one to finally say what they were both thinking: it's time to get help. That's when Sam finally decided to take action. He reached out to a doctor who told him about PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. Sam's symptoms were getting in the way of enjoying his life. Re-experiencing, hyperarousal, feeling worse about yourself or the world, and avoidance are the 4 types of symptoms people with PTSD have. Sam's doctor explained each. The first is reliving the event, or re-experiencing. This is often an unwanted memory or even a flashback where you feel like you're right back in the situation again. Seeing, hearing, or even smelling something that reminds you of the trauma can trigger these. Nightmares where you relive parts of the event in your sleep are common too. The second is avoidance, staying away from situations that remind you of the trauma. That's why Sam tries to avoid thinking about painful memories altogether. He pours himself into his work or uses alcohol to keep his mind from going back to the trauma. The third is feeling worse about yourself or the world since the trauma. You might feel overwhelming guilt like Sam or not trust anyone. You just might not be able to feel happy, even when you are around people you love. The fourth type of symptom is sudden rushes of anger, irritability, feeling jittery, always on alert, always on the lookout for danger. This is called hyperarousal, and loud noises or a driver cutting in front of you can be all it takes to set you off. If you recognize any of these symptoms of PTSD in yourself or someone you love, don't wait. See your doctor to find out if it could be PTSD. Just like Sam and Tara found, there is hope. You don't have to live with the symptoms of PTSD forever. Effective treatments are available. To learn more about PTSD or how to get help, visit the National Center for PTSD website at www.ptsd.va.gov.
All right, I'd love to hear your comments here. Look at your comments in the chat box. If you have any feedback on that video or ways that you think it could be useful in your role and the services you're providing to the veterans and service members and their families. I found it really helpful when meeting with a veteran to share a video like this and to talk about it. What stood out to you? What can you relate to? Does this resonate with you in different kinds of ways? It's a really nice way to bring in a very short video to open up a discussion in that way, and also just provide education in that regard. And so I think sometimes questions may come in, why does one person go on to develop PTSD while others do not? And there's no one factor. There's no one specific clear answer. I have worked with individuals who've been at the same situation, who were battle buddies, and one went on to develop PTSD and one didn't at the same, situation. We're right next to each other. There's a lot of different things that go into it. But some factors that can kind of play into it are personal factors such as one's own history of trauma exposure, whether it's through childhood or multiple exposures during a period of time or over one's lifetime, or even ongoing exposure to trauma, as well as psychiatric history and demographic history. And we're really working to better understand genes related to PTSD. The type of traumatic event can have an impact if someone goes on from a natural, if you will, disaster to trauma exposures that happened in combat or assault. And then another factor to take into account is the recovery environment, as well as one's own, if you will, resiliency in that regard. There's a lot of different factors that play into the development of PTSD, and the support that was able to be given at the time after the event and kind of the situation that after an event, or if it was an ongoing period of time and ongoing exposures. And I think the other piece to really take into consideration is that when individuals present with distress related to trauma exposure and PTSD, it often isn't alone, meaning that there's other co-occurring things that may be also related to some of the disruption in functioning and distress. So this slide really goes over about 80% of individuals with PTSD also have one or more other mental health problem, whether it's depression, substance use, other anxiety disorders. And that's important to really take into account because there may be multiple ways that we can support an individual in their recovery. Other things that may be going on with this co-occurring problems or difficulties could put someone less or reduced, if you will, quality of life, their own experience in their lifetime in regards to satisfaction with things, whether it's the environment, relationships. The way you may define quality of life may be different from someone else. So I really look at how they're thinking that their quality of life is, as well as increased rates of unemployment, increased rates of medical comorbidity as well. Stressors at home, which you all may be well familiar with because you really do a wonderful job servicing families and social support as well, and also increased risk for suicide attempts. I think a really important part of this is and I went back to share initially how about 50% of women and 60% of men have exposure to a trauma at some point in their lifetime. But not everybody goes on to develop PTSD. A small percent of individuals, when you look at that, actually go on to develop it. It is higher with combat trauma. We see with our recent returning OEF or OIF or OND veterans, their rates vary from about 15 to 17% are diagnosed with PTSD following combat exposure. But usually it's much lower across all populations within the US. That's just a little bit of background on PTSD to kind of put us all on the same page. Now what I'd like to do is shift gears and just highlight a few key points from the revised clinical practice guidelines that were developed by VA and DoD clinical experts, research scientists that work collaboratively to come up with these recommendations. This was a revision from the 2010 guideline. And I want to say it is a guideline. It is not a thing that is meant to dictate clinical care. It is really meant to help inform you all as administrators, providers, in whatever capacity you are, to know what is the strongest recommendations for helping an individual have the best chance at recovery from PTSD. So a couple things that really came out of it, and I'm just highlighting a few. There were several recommendations, but I just wanted to kind of get your minds thinking about what this recommendation entailed and also what it really, how it can be helpful in your role. So there was a strong recommendation that really suggests screening for PTSD. So when I was talking with Anthony about the different veteran and service members that you serve in different populations, even if someone initially has a screening for PTSD, it may not if you will, have a positive screening, meaning that it warrants further assessment for diagnosis of PTSD, it is recommended that you do periodically screen for PTSD. And so there are two different ways that these recommendations were made. It's called the PC-PTSD-5, so that stands for Primary Care PTSD-5. It's 5 items, which is nice to have that in there. It also corresponds to the DSM-5. And then there's also the Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Checklist 5, which is a 20-item scale. And these are all self-report, pretty limited time that it takes to administer these, and also look at kind of the score of those to see if a further assessment is warranted. So for the 5-item questionnaire, if 3 or more are responded yes, related to difficulties as a result of trauma exposure, then I would recommend looking into further evaluation for potential diagnosis of PTSD. And for the PCL-5, that ranges from starts at a 0 to 80, and anything above a 33 would be indicative of looking at additional assessment. The other part that was the biggest change in my mind, really, for the clinical practice guideline was the recommendation of psychotherapy, individual, manualized, trauma-focused psychotherapy over all other interventions. And that includes medication, which was a big shift in there, as well as other psychotherapies for the treatment of PTSD. It's that individualized. These are typically delivered in a weekly format. There's a lot of promising research about different formats for delivery for these treatments, but I'm just going to kind of focus on those over about 3 months, ranging in sessions usually between 8 and 15, depending on the different protocol, and there's flexibilities within those manualized treatments. And these treatments have been found to be effective in the short term as well as over time, so up to 5 years where they've looked at this, and also have been found to be effective, meaning treating PTSD and decreasing symptom severity in very complex populations with chronic PTSD, also having comorbidities and very complex trauma history. 3 that I'm going to mention and spend just a little bit more time on, which you may all be very familiar with and have heard of, are cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure, and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. On the right-hand side of this screen that you will see right here are other treatments that are part of that individual manualized trauma-focused psychotherapy that are also recommended as, if you will, frontline treatments for PTSD, which is written narrative exposure. Many of you may have heard of written exposure therapy that has come up. And they also just recently released a manual in April, available to the public, as well as brief eclectic psychotherapy and other cognitive behavioral therapies for PTSD. To give you a gauge, and I also wanted to, because I'm not going to talk much about medications in this, medications and non-trauma focused psychotherapy are what we call kind of a second line recommendation. And when those are really recommended is if the frontline treatments of psychotherapy are not available, or someone is not willing to engage in that approach to treatment, you may want to consider the second line, which includes SSRIs and SNRIs. What this slide is really going over is giving you a quick snapshot of what those 3 different psychotherapies that I mentioned. And the reason why I chose those is those 3 really have extensive evidence around them for their effectiveness in helping individuals recover from PTSD. And so I thought that it would be helpful because my understanding in your clinics is these are also ones that are more commonly also being delivered. So for you in your roles, it may be helpful to understand what they entail. So for cognitive processing therapy, it works to teach to reframe negative thoughts about the trauma. And you do that through talking and also do writing assignments and worksheets. For prolonged exposure, it teaches the individual how to gain control by facing their fears in a comfortable but uncomfortable way and in a safe way. And that's done by talking about the trauma, and you start to do things that you've been avoiding, but that are safe. And then there's EMDR, which helps you process and make sense of the trauma. And that is often done through, when you bring the trauma to mind, you're also focusing on an external motion that goes what they call bilateral movements back and forth, that helps with the processing. And then there's also those pieces around medication. What I'd like to do, and I do this clinically with some of the veterans that I work with, where if I'm meeting with them individually, they're really valuing the information that I'm saying, but also would like to hear about it from another veteran, about their experiences. So the National Center for PTSD has developed, it's a website called About Face, where it's a great opportunity where veterans have volunteered to share their story about recovery from PTSD, what PTSD was like for them, impact it's had on their life, and then what treatment and recovery has been like. Also, there's family members and social support who've shared their experiences, as well as clinicians. So what I'd like to do is introduce you to Horace Ace Carter and briefly allow him to share his experiences in recovery from PTSD while engaging in one of these treatments.
I can't even tell you, I have tears in my eyes right now because every time I think about it, my life is much more meaningful now than it's ever been in the past 10 or 12 years. Much more meaningful. I don't get angry. I don't think about killing myself. I don't think about hurting others. I mean, even in my community, in my where I live at, the kids come around me and they call me Candy Man because I give them candy, people, on my way to work, they approach me, they tell me how nice I look, how I dress, and my job, everybody, they say, hey, there's a position coming open in the company, you should apply for it. These things never happened to me before. I used to be holding on to my job by a string. Now people want me to further advance, even as a travel agent in my job, people now come to me to help plan their vacation, and they value who I am and what I do. And I'm a new man. And I owe it to CPT treatment in PTSD.
So hopefully you all get kind of a sense of some of the power of those videos and how genuine and meaningful it is when someone shares their story and you can bring that into the room. I've often shared the About Face website with veterans or family members that I've met with that really want to kind of better understand their options or what it's like or how they can be helpful and feel connected if they're not in a place where they're not able to connect with others because they're not around or just don't have access to talking with other veterans in that way or family. I had mentioned kind of the second line if those trauma-focused treatments aren't available or if a veteran is not willing or service member to engage in those treatments, what those second line treatments would be. In regards to the medication, in this guideline, they made specific recommendations under that class of medications for sertraline, paroxetine, fluoxetine, and venlafaxine, as well as alternatives to non-trauma focused psychotherapy. There's present-centered therapy, there's stress inoculation, and you may hear IPT, which is interpersonal psychotherapy. And it's not, I think, and this bottom part of the slide is important. It says insufficient evidence to recommend one over the other, meaning they wouldn't say we recommend medication over non-trauma focused psychotherapy or vice versa. They're both at the same level of evidence. So how effective are these frontline treatments, right, that we talked about with these individual manualized trauma-focused psychotherapies? So this is a infographic that the National Center for PTSD developed. One you can order free, which I will tell you how to do that later on if you would like copies of this. And about 53 out of 100, meaning out of every 100 individuals who engage in a trauma-focused psychotherapy, 53 no longer meet diagnostic criteria for PTSD after 3 months. 42 out of 100 for medication. And I also mentioned earlier in the presentation that there are individuals who recover from PTSD on their own, but only about 9 out of 100. So it's a very small individuals who do not get treatment, who have been diagnosed with PTSD will recover on their own. So I talked about a bunch of different treatment options that can be discussed in regards to treating PTSD. I think one of the really important things to be aware of is how do we help someone make that decision about the best way to proceed and recommended way. In the clinical practice guideline, there was a recommendation about engaging in shared decision making. And this isn't, for example, myself as a provider telling someone what they should do. It's really a process between myself and the client that I'm serving, where I share the options that I'm able to offer and that are available for treating PTSD and give them the best chance at recovery. Answering questions, I will share that video and I'll show you some other videos that I do use to help an individual understand and what that treatment entails, and also giving them the best information that I have available about the research and my clinical experience in delivering those and helping them in their recovery process. One thing that I was really happy to hear about, and I commend you all for really kind of being on the forefront and getting this moving, is delivering PTSD treatment and treatment that you all offer to veterans or service members or family members who are not able to come into the office or prefer to receive it at home. So VA has really taken the forefront and really wanted to expand the offering of what we call home-based or VA Video Connect. That's our what we use to connect to the veteran at home. And so I've found as a provider it extremely rewarding to be able to offer home-based services. So for example, I use that as part of my shared decision-making process. I offer in-person treatment, video treatment. I offer a combination. If some weeks they want to do it over video or in person, as long as someone's willing to go on this journey of recovery and let me help them, I am more than happy to do it. And what makes it the most convenient, given that it is, it's hard to do hard work. And I want to make it as easy as possible and accessible as possible. For example, I just recently completed treatment with a veteran who was the primary caretaker for one of his disabled children and was not able to drive to the VA, which was about a 45-minute drive, and drive home for 45 minutes and have our hour session while trying to find parking and everything, because the child was only receiving services for a 2-hour window. So if he wasn't able to receive the in-home services, he wouldn't have been able to take the time for the treatment to help him recover from PTSD so he could be the father he really wanted to be for his son. So I just use that as an example. The research has shown that this is as effective as it in person, and that there are a lot of benefits to being able to have this as an option for veterans, whether they're in rural sites or have other kind of reasons they're not able to make it into the office. All right, I am gonna really spend some time and kind of go through these resources, and it's just gonna get your mind thinking, okay, got a sense we're all on the same page of what PTSD is. There's a lot of different treatment options out there. So how can we help our loved ones of the veterans or service members feel supported and be able to kind of know about some of the resources? So let me start with telling you some of them. All right, this is my thing, buckle up. We're gonna go on a quick ride through these, and I will tell you again, I work for the consultation program. An appropriate use of the consultation program, which I'll tell you how to access, is to contact them and talk about resources and maybe someone that you are working with or aware of and asking what we recommend. Feel free to do that. a couple kinds of things that hopefully you're aware of is the Veterans Crisis Hotline, where it's 1-800-273-8255 and then pressing 1 for veterans. There also is a really important resource out there that is, again, everything I'm talking about is free. Let me kind of state that as well. It's called Coaching into Care. This is a free service for social support, family members of a loved one that they're worried about and would like to get them connected with care. And they can contact this, and it's free one-on-one coaching, how to help them help their loved one. In addition to About Face, there is a VA product that is called Make the Connection. So About Face, which was the video of Mr. Carter that I showed, is just specific to PTSD. Make the Connection also has some other stories of veterans beyond just PTSD and other sorts of mental health recovery processes that they may have gone through. This is the website for About Face. You know, I find videos to be very powerful, and in my work, I found them to be very well received, but for some individuals, they do not have access to the internet or have the internet capabilities to stream a video, whether it's not just in my office, but if they're looking at it at home. The National Center for PTSD has developed a bunch of different Understanding PTSD series. So these are what I call booklets, because they're about 16 or so pages. They're in English and Spanish. And so one of them is related to understanding PTSD, geared towards the individual impact of PTSD. And then another one is Understanding PTSD, a guide for family and friends. So very different kind of, but also really all in service of helping an individual recover from PTSD. Within that booklet for Understanding PTSD talks about what it is, what can result in PTSD, how do you know if you have symptoms related to PTSD, what would be beneficial receiving treatment, what happens during treatment, and then what should I look for in a mental health provider, and where can I go to get help? Similarly, with the guide for family and friends, it helps them learn about PTSD, different ways, like what can I do to help my loved one? Talks a little bit about those. Different things that may be helpful with communication, and also extremely important is how that loved one in social support can help take care of themselves, as well as other information and resources. So if you don't have these booklets readily available, I highly encourage you to get them. I showed you the video about what is PTSD. There are several videos around even evidence-based treatment, different psychotherapies, medications, how to kind of know about your options, and PTSD in the brain. They're all about 3 minutes, and you got a little glimpse of that, what is PTSD. I encourage you to look at the other ones if you'd be interested in looking at them. In addition to those, there are several mobile apps that range from self-care to skills, to treatment companions. And what I mean by a treatment companion, you use it in conjunction with the treatment that you're doing. And I've highlighted a few that may be important for you to be aware of. First, there's the PTSD Coach app, which was our first app that came out through the National Center for PTSD. It provides a lot of education about PTSD and treatment, helps someone get kind of that self-assessment through different questions they may ask and track how things are going, and also provides skills and ways to connect when in need of a crisis. Again, this app is not, and all of these apps are not in lieu of, meaning it's not in place of focused face-to-face care, but can be very helpful. There also is a family coach app, similar to kind of what some of the other things I described, provides education, information, especially related to children, and different tools to help manage and build connection and networks, and how to kind of, for the family, tracking their own stress over time to see how things are going. If someone does not have their own smartphone, which is definitely the case in some situations, there is a PTSD coach online, which means it's computer-based. And if someone doesn't have a computer, I will often recommend seeing if they're able to go to the public library And this is kind of a souped up version of the PTSD Coach, which is the mobile app version. The online has a bit more tools in there, where you can also watch videos from an expert clinician that will describe different skills and different ways you can use that skill depending on what's going on. There is a mobile app as well as an online tool for something called Vet Change. And this is a free online program for individuals who are working to manage problems related to drinking and also PTSD. Another free online training related to this is related to moving forward, which is called a problem solving training, as well as for veterans who are looking and family members to learn more about parenting, as well as anger management and improving their sleep. There are those 4 programs there that, again, are free access for any individual looking for that additional training. Now, I just did a little bit of a snippet of the different apps that are available and other kind of programs. This is a prescription pad. I wish I had one in my office. I would have just picked it up and showed it to you in addition to this slide, where I will be meeting with someone and kind of help them see what they're interested in, and I will check those boxes for them. I'll also write recommendations in that bottom line, and these are, again, available free for order if that would be something that you or your team think would be useful. And I will promise I will get to how you do that. Another resource that has been developed by the National Center for PTSD is this treatment decision aid. And I'll tell you what that is. It is a free online, it's an app online, but it's really through the kind of computer, or you can use it through your phone, where you can learn about PTSD. One can compare different treatments, and then if they want to take action, meaning kind of connect with a medical provider or mental health provider, what do they need to do? And they'll help them think through different questions to consider, and it becomes a tailored, individualized opportunity for someone to then print out what they filled out in this comparison chart of the different treatments, or things they want to make sure they ask their provider to then bring to their provider to ask. This is just a screenshot about different ways they can learn about PTSD, but in particular, this screenshot focuses on treatments that they may want to learn about. And this is just what the treatment comparison chart looks like, where you can give it a thumbs up, and then at the end, you get a summary of what treatment you seem to really think would be a good match and something to talk about with your provider. There are also user guides to help a provider when doing and using the decision aid with their clients, as well as flyers you can print out. Now, those were just kind of an introduction to some of the resources available for veterans and social support. I want to talk about, for you as providers, and I use the word providers because you're providing, in whatever capacity it is, a service to help our veterans in their recovery, whether it's direct clinical care or administrative or team building in whatever way. There are several consultation programs available. There is a suicide risk management program that is available to community providers like yourselves, where you can ask questions about risk, conceptualizations, lethal means safety counseling, how to engage high-risk veterans. And the way you make a consult is to email srmconsult@va.gov. This is free and unlimited resource for you. And we have a partnership with the Military Sexual Trauma Consultation Program, but I'm gonna talk a little bit about that because we work together, and I'm gonna go to this one, as part of the PTSD consultation program. And this is the program that I work for. And this is an opportunity where any individual who's involved in the veterans or service care has questions about trauma or PTSD is welcome to contact us. You can call us or email us at ptsdconsult@va.gov. You may have questions about residential level of care, questions about diagnosis, questions like, you know, we have a veteran and family member coming in. I'm wondering what resources or handouts you'd recommend. Or I'm looking to learn more about PTSD and substance use disorders. What do you recommend? Or I'd like to take a course. This is what I'm interested in. Anything under the sun, you are free, and I encourage you to reach out to us. We also have a monthly consultation lecture series. It is the third Wednesday of each month. On this slide, you will see upcoming talks that are coming up, and this is really informed by questions that come into the consultation program. And we really work to identify future lectures based on what the field is asking and wanting to learn about. We have several continuing education courses that are really, I just recently got a consult that was looking to learn more about PTSD and psychotic disorders. And we have a wonderful course that was just published related to that. There's information about how to keep a veteran engaged in treatment. Anything really under the sun related to PTSD, we work on getting those courses up. Something else available to you all, depending on kind of your familiarity. Anthony had shared with me that a notable amount of the employees in the network are also veterans themselves. But if you're not as familiar with veteran culture and service members, we have a lot of resources in the community provider toolkit that can be helpful. And these are toolkits for, and you'll see clergy members. Campus toolkits are great for educators that are working with veterans. Veterans employment are great for employers, things to consider when hiring and working with veterans, as well as police officers. And last but absolutely not least, in the work that we all do within mental health is so important, and it's so important to take care of yourself, and we have a toolkit related to that for some tips. We have several manuals and guidelines that are available through the website. And also, if you're interested in learning more about kind of the latest or historically different research projects that have been done, we also have a free database that you are free to search and look for articles. And it sounds great to be able to do that, but you may not have time. So fortunately, the National Center for PTSD has about 3 publications that come out that really summarize, and I often say, like, distill the research down. Instead of reading a full research paper, they help just take the takeaway points of kind of cutting edge research, which is within the Clinician's Trauma Update. And then there is a PTSD Research Quarterly that comes out quarterly in that regard on a topic that is really hot in the literature, meaning that it's really been getting a lot of attention because that's really what is needed in the field. So for example, there was recently one on PTSD and sleep. This is focal brain stimulation and PTSD. And then there's also a monthly update, and these can get emailed to you free. Now, I have talked to you several times about ways to order some of our materials for free. What you do is you go to this website, and the Government Publishing Office has partnered with us, where you place your order, put in your address, and it is shipped to you free. So please, of the different materials that I mentioned, that was just a few things within that, what we have to offer. There are a lot there. And as part of PTSD Awareness Month, if you're open to even getting some of these materials, I highly encourage you to do it, not just this month, but moving forward in your clinics. Some key points. I told you I had a lot to share. Thank you all for bearing with me. Is that there are several effective options for treating PTSD. It is wonderful to be able to offer someone a choice in their recovery, and we have great treatments that allow us to do that. There's lots of resources, but if there are some that you want to kind of take away, because I went through a lot, is I encourage you to look at the PTSD Treatment Decision Aid. There's the booklet for understanding PTSD, and we have the whiteboard videos. And when in doubt, honestly, and I really mean this, please feel free to reach out to us. This is what we're here for, to help you all in the services in whatever capacity that may be, to helping veterans and service members and their family and loved ones improve their quality of life and recover. So, well, I didn't leave much time, but hopefully Anthony has been able to catch the chat. And with that said, I shared some of our products, but if you're not seeing something that could be helpful in the work that you do, please put that in the chat and let us know, because that's how we really work to develop these products, is from hearing from what people really are looking for in addition to what we already have. So I really thank you very much for your time and focus during this presentation. It was a lot of information. I hope it was useful and is useful moving forward. And I will take a break and see if, Anthony, you have any kind of questions that came through.
Yeah. First of all, I wanted to say thank you. That was very helpful, especially for a lot of us who aren't clinicians, to get that perspective and some of the definitions around what it is we talk about every day and what it is we're trying to do, especially putting the explanations behind our use of evidence-based practices. It was nice to hear how some of those are used from a practical standpoint. I think we do have a couple of questions. Kate Sullivan wanted to ask one, at least. Kate, you can go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks, Anthony. Hi, Elissa. I was just wondering, you were talking about how some people experience it versus some people don't, having experienced a traumatic experience. Just said experience 17 times in a row. But I was wondering if there's any sort of preventative measures that are out there, knowing that people might experience it. Are there other things that people can do to prevent?
Yeah. So I think, in some of the services in the Army, they're even doing some, if you will, resiliency training to help kind of just bring up and allow individuals in that regard around resilience. I think there's a lot of things preventatively in regards to preventing trauma. I think a lot goes around the environment and support that an individual may or may not have. To me, that is something that has really been an important part. We can't stop, unfortunately. If we could, trust me, I would do everything trauma from happening in that way. And I think there's a big part of it is decreasing stigma around kind of when someone experiences trauma, to not feel ashamed or guilt if they're struggling after it, or extract meaning that it means something about them as a person or their own identity as an individual. So I think one of the biggest things we can do is to decrease the stigma and get the word out there that there's help out there, and provide that support. I think other things, I think it comes into a larger sociological kind of question, in ways that we as a society, I think coming together as a community and being supportive of each other helps when there is tragedy and trauma that happens, even within a community. So I think fostering that supportive environment, cross-cutting, I think helps not only with PTSD, but other aspects of stress. Much larger than probably our networks, but I think, and I truly believe this, that every individual can have an impact, whether it's with a particular individual, larger group, or even within the community. And if we can help foster that and help each other out when we may be knocked down, whether it's through a traumatic event or something else, I think that lends itself enormously to helping each other. That's just my kind of personal take on that as well, because I think we're not only seeing combat trauma, we've really over the last 5 years, from gun violence, right, to other aspects of other natural tragedies. I just talked with a provider who was located in Dayton, and I'm not sure how familiar, 2 weeks ago, I think it was now, tornadoes really impacted North Dayton, and that community was so impacted. And coming together to help each other in that way really is crucial in those times, whether it's an isolated trauma for an individual or a community. There are also some things within the National Center, and I can talk if these come up, is we have a lot of things to help after a disaster that may be useful too. But that's kind of a separate question in that regard. But if we can work to come together as a community and foster support, I think that is a huge way, whether it's your battle buddies or your platoon, but in the larger community setting as well.
Right. That makes perfect sense. Elissa, I wanted to ask you, is there anything you could share with us about telehealth? You mentioned that our network has gotten up to 13% now of all of our active clients have done at least one session in that way. Any tips on how you can talk about that, how you get your clients to do their care that way as opposed to in person, because we're always talking about it as a network and looking to adopt, you know, some best practices around offering that and having that adopted more.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple kinds of things. I think I share my screen a bit in that kind of way. I help veterans not feel like it's that they're missing out on anything if they're completing a measure or they're looking at something to track kind of progress. I've also used it a lot as a way to bring family in. A family member may not be able to come into the office, but I found it extremely helpful if a family member has questions and the veteran is hesitant about doing psychotherapy over telehealth. I'm like, would you like to try a family meeting that way before we get into this to see if there's any questions? And that has been an inlet to veterans being open to it. They're like, oh, it actually was a great way to connect. Like, I didn't feel like I had to take off the morning to come kind of see you. It was really helpful that my partner was able to be involved in that way. So I really try to think outside the box in ways of engaging and making it easier for them in that regard. I think the apps can also be a great supplement to that. I think another piece is you don't have to be tech savvy to do telehealth. And I think that's often kind of a misnomer. I think like, whoa, that's a lot of IT. In VA, it's as simple as clicking one link and we're connected. I also will really try to kind of understand, and I think it's different for every person. Sometimes there's a concern around confidentiality, and we talk about how that is locked, that people can't get in. But really, the benefits of them staying connected is the most important. And one of the things I do, Anthony, that I think I've really found helpful is it doesn't have to be one way or the other. We can do telehealth, and if you change your mind, absolutely, let's switch to in-person. Or, you know, if you're, you know, traveling and you're not available, instead of going 2 weeks without an appointment, let's still have our appointment over telehealth, touch base in person. And really giving, I think with trauma, a lot of time, choice or kind of power has been taken away. I give it to the veteran or service member for them to be able to have the choice and really leave it in their court and try to help them think through it, advantages, disadvantages. But often once someone does it, it's a great experience in that way.
Right. No, that's great. There's a lot of helpful tips there with our the way we'll use telehealth as well. So thank you. This has been great. I appreciate all the efforts here and your answering the questions at the end. For the group, I will share the entire video, all the handouts, the presentations, everything we'll get from Elissa we'll put into our clinic's portal in a nice blog post, and we'll open up the avenue to ask more questions as well. So we'll send those your way as they come in.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody. Feel free to email me directly or even email the consult program. We are more than happy to take your questions and kind of talk through things if that would be helpful at any point.